Hi, this is lecture 2. In this lecture, we're going to talk about dog origins and the archaeology of dog-human relationships. So, as you may recall from lecture 1, I talked about the broader field of anthropology and how there are different subfields or sort of branches of anthropology that focus on different aspects of what it means to be human. This is a primarily cultural anthropology course, but we are going to look a bit, and especially in this week's material, at what archaeologists can tell us about dogs, particularly going sort of way back in time to that transition from wolves to dogs, and also that transition as it accompanied the growing or increasingly close relationship between humans and canines. So what we're going to talk about in this lecture is the material you've been reading about those archaeological finds that tell us something about that timeline and that start to give us at least some theories about what exactly that transition from wolf to dog and from wolves as wild animals to dogs as domesticated animals, what that transition looked like. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on. So I thought I'd start just with sort of a real quick overview of what the broad strokes of what we know about this topic. And this is something that came through in all the stuff you read and also in that brief little film that I had you watch, right? So this is sort of, again, the quick version of what that co-evolution of humans and canines looks like from what we know from the archaeological evidence. I'll say, this is discussed in the readings that you looked at this week, but just to sort of underline it, one of the things we need to think about when we think about this kind of research and what we can and can't know from it is what archaeologists are actually looking at, right? So cultural anthropologists, which is, the kind of training that I have, we're social scientists. So we are working in the present or in the very recent past. Like we'll also look at, historical documents and things like that. But, if I want to know something about the relationships between people and dogs, I can go observe it in real time. I can ask people questions, right? I can go to a PetSmart and see all the stuff in there. There's all kinds of avenues for me to know something about it. Like there's various kinds of copious amounts of evidence available to me. Archaeologists are looking at remains from a previous time in history. And when they are looking at something way back in history, like what we're going to be talking about just now, there's not that much stuff left, right? Think about it. Like, what are the things that remain for thousands upon thousands of years? They're only going to be the things that are dense enough to not disintegrate over those thousands of years, right? So primarily what they're able to look at in the case of this question about wolves, dogs, humans, are bones, right? And again, not even entire skeletons, but often, a bone or a fragment of a bone. So again, it's a very different way of sort of collecting information and trying to piece together a story of what happened from those relatively rare items that you can find. Okay, so that's part of the reason, I wanted to say that is, it's part of the reason that we don't have a completely clear answer to the question of what was that transition from wild wolves to domesticated dogs? What did that look like? And when exactly did it take place? There just isn't a ton of stuff you can look at. There are some things, though, and we'll talk about that in this lecture today. Okay, so the overall arc, what do we know? We know that dogs are the first animal that was domesticated by humans. And we know that the sort of trajectory, both the sort of physical and social evolution of both humans and dogs are closely connected. And we know that dogs, that sort of transition from wolves to dogs, goes back at least 15,000 years and perhaps longer. We also know where that evolution began, right? So wolves were domesticated in Eurasia, where gray wolves shared territory with humans. They shared the same hunting grounds, and that is where we think the sort of beginnings of this relationship took place. There's then, at this point, a little bit of debate about exactly how that happened. So one idea is that more docile wolves were kind of selected by humans, right? The ones that were friendlier are ones that humans sort of picked out and spent more time on. and it can be a combination of these two, the wolves are the ones who approach the humans, right? Whether it is for food scraps or the warmth of the fire at a human encampment, right? Those are some of the kinds of theories. So did the wolves pick the humans or did the humans pick the wolves? Not completely clear, but we know that there was indeed a closer connection made at least by 15,000 years ago. And then, of course, we know up through the present that over time humans more actively bred dogs, what were then dogs, for certain traits, right? So if you trace it far enough, you get to all the specific dog breeds that we have today that all have their origins in that history with gray wolves and humans 15,000 years ago. But clearly, today's modern dog breeds are the result of a great deal of very specific breeding techniques by humans who wanted to transform dogs into particular breeds, right? Okay, so that's the sort of the background or the big overarching story. Now, let's look a little bit more specifically at some of the arguments, the findings and arguments that particular archaeological studies are making. One of the pieces that I had you read is the Perry et al. And what this team of researchers is looking at is the relationship really between the domestication of dogs, or that wolf-dog transition, as it connects to the movement of people into the Americas, right? So it's about both human migration and the ways that the wolf-dog transition was sort of intersecting with that migration. So what these researchers did is looked at evidence of, again, proto-dogs, right? Like sort of dogs in transition or animals in transition between wolf and dog, and evidence of human presence across particularly Siberia, right? Which is where this sort of beginning of this story happened, and into the Americas in places like Alaska, right? And what they found is that it is likely that as humans migrated across what was then the Bering Land Bridge, right, that at the time connected Asia and the Americas, that those people, those humans, brought dogs with them. So in fact, dogs were integral to, and frankly were sort of a part of, that migratory journey from the Asian continent into the Americas. And there's evidence, of some of those very earliest archaeological items that are found in Alaska that tell us about that timeline, right? So what Perry et al. Are suggesting then is something that pushes that timeline back quite a bit, right, from that more typically cited 15,000 years ago. What this set of researchers are arguing is that dogs were first domesticated in Siberia around 23,000 years ago, right? So considerably earlier, and that then those newly domesticated dogs accompanied people as they migrated into the Americas and were with them, the dogs were with them then as they moved out and dispersed across the continent over time. So again, this is not the end of the story. There's still lots of research being done and debates about exactly what all these different specimens mean. But this is a suggestion of both the central role of dogs in human migration and an even earlier timeline for when domestication took place. All right. So the next piece I had you read, I'm actually really excited for you to be able to read because this is really hot off the press, this research. So the piece I had you read is a New York Times article, and it was just published in late December of 2024. So like literally as I was thinking about, my syllabus for this semester and revising it, I saw this article and I was like, oh, we've got to include that, right? So the Nazarian is a New York Times reporter who is reporting on this scientific study, right? The study itself was published a few weeks earlier. So it's still very recently, in early December of 2024. And what this research study, which is, I put it down here, right? So I didn't have you read the original, right? The scientific paper. I'm having you read the New York Times article, but if you wanted to, you could go see it. So what this team of researchers in this scientific paper are talking about is their discovery of this bone, right? So what they discovered is a 12,000-year-old leg bone, okay? And what their testing of that bone demonstrated is that the owner of this leg bone, the animal's mother was a wolf, and the owner of this bone had a fish-heavy diet, right? Ate a lot of fish. So as you read in the article, that starts to suggest some things to us, right? It suggests that we're right on the cusp between wolf and dog, and that at this point, the suggestion is that people were feeding this animal, right? That there was enough of a fish-heavy diet that this would not be based on, for example, picking up the scraps that were discarded by people. And, canines are not known to fish, right? So on their own. So the suggestion is if this animal had a fish-heavy diet, it meant humans were feeding it fish, right? So a fascinating way to understand, through a bone, right? That's all you've got. Something not only about the sort of biology of this creature, but something that indicates something about the social relationships between people and canines at that point in time, okay? So this recent paper, the one that was just published, is about this specimen. But there's others that sort of contribute to this story. So the other piece that's mentioned in the article is this piece, which is an 8,000-year-old jawbone. Okay, so again, this is what these researchers are working with, right? They have like one thing that they can look at, right? And they can get a lot of information from it, but there isn't always a lot of context for understanding, what they can tell. So this, the jawbone, what they are able to understand about that bone is that it's from a female, right, a female animal, and that the female's fetus, right, the female was pregnant, female's fetus, again, showed a salmon-rich or fish-rich diet, right? And they were even more able to sort of extrapolate something else about that by doing the math and figuring out that the fetus of this pregnant female animal was conceived in winter, okay? So again, it means that these animals were not just fending for themselves. They were being provided food by the humans around them, okay? So, again, it's not like you can't claim within a shadow of a doubt that that's what's going on, but that's what these researchers are arguing, right? So it is possible that these sort of proto-dogs or these kind of wolf dogs, right, there's in this moment of evolutionary transition, that they were scavenging the fish, right, that people ate fish and they, threw some of the bones aside and the dogs ate that, or more likely that they were purposefully fed. And the reason that the researchers land on the argument that they were being purposefully fed is that, the evidence is that they weren't just eating a little fish, they were eating a lot of fish, right? So they suggest if it were just scraps, we would not see the evidence that we have, okay? So again, this is an interesting way to get at some idea about what was going on between dogs and humans back these many thousands of years ago. So the next piece I had you read has another sort of interesting way of trying to understand something about that relationship. Again, based on the kinds of things that archaeologists can retrieve, right? So it's only, again, the durable things that survive that they're able to see, right? So this article, the Mori and Jaeger, looks at burials, right, which are, again, something that tends to remain for a long time, which is why archaeologists often look at them, but something more specific than that, which is occasions where they have found humans and dogs buried together, right? So, right, that's already pretty interesting. Humans and dogs buried in the same burial site, which, again, sort of begs a bunch of questions, like what's going on there? Right? Again, these are people who are from long ago. We can't ask them, what were your mortuary practices like? What was your relationship with this dog that you were buried with? Right? We need to try to figure that out by looking at these remains. So what Mori and Jaeger tell us is that there are actually quite a number of examples of these joint dog-human burials, where people and dogs are buried in the same burial site. And they are really dispersed, meaning you find examples of these from many different places in the world and over a long time span. So this is not some like unusual isolated incident. Like there's only one time we found it. It's like, it's a theme, right? That people being buried with dogs is something that's taken place for a long time in a lot of different cultural contexts. So Maureen Jager is sort of, again, trying to give us a sense of like, how do we make sense of this? Or what can we claim that those kinds of burials tell us about human-canine relationships? Well, the first question you have to answer if you start looking at these kinds of findings is, how do you know that it's a purposeful burial, right? Like, what if it's just that a human and a dog both died and they happen to be in the same space and that was, covered over and archaeologists dug it up? How do you know if it's quote unquote a burial, right? So the implication of something being a burial is that there's something kind of purposeful and significant about it, right? So in other words, it's not just that somebody happened to die and their dog died next to them, right? It's something where people, in this case, a person and a dog, were purposefully interred, right? That whoever was doing this mortuary rite carefully and purposefully put them into this gravesite together, right? And that there was something sort of at least symbolically significant about the way it was done. These are the kinds of criteria that they're using to categorize these remains as a burial, as opposed to just bones, right? And so they did find evidence for that, right? So in other words, something that doesn't look like a random collection of bones in a particular place, but a purposefully laid out burial, where the person was positioned in a certain way, the dog was positioned in a certain way, and often in these sort of ancient burial sites, there's other stuff, right? It's not just bones. There are things like grave goods, right? So people may have been buried with objects that either reflected something about their life or reflected something about, how people imagined the afterlife. So again, we've got a number of these examples. Burial sites where there are at least one dog and one person, and where it's culturally elaborated, where it's significant and symbolic in some way, including things like they're having interred also grave goods, okay? Beyond that, then archaeologists really have to kind of speculate to some extent, right? That still doesn't tell us, well, why did they do that? What was the meaning? But you can start to think about some of the implications of these sites. So we can certainly use some of our own perspective how we interact with dogs today, right? It's entirely possible that people, for very long periods of time and across the world, consider dogs to be family members, right? That they're valued, and therefore they might be buried in the same gravesite. There may also be connections between dogs and conceptions of what comes after death, right? That dogs may be companions in the afterlife, right? So there's the suggestion that there may be some religious or spiritual implications to the way these burials were done. But to some extent, we have to speculate a bit. It's hard to get a firm answer on what those meanings are. What we do know, though, is that this is a not uncommon practice to bury people and dogs together, and it certainly says something about the closeness of our relationship. So I think sort of the take-home ideas from this Maureen Jager article are, some more general things we can bear in mind as we start to look across the course at examples of people interacting with dogs in lots of ways over space and time. And that's that dogs have, in many different contexts, been regarded as spiritually significant, right? Not just as companions in this life, but part of a broader worldview or a broader cosmology. And also that idea about dogs having a lot of meaning, right, in the universe and for people is something that is, I wouldn't say universal, but it's something we find a lot in a lot of different places at a lot of different times, right? So in other words, the fact that, as I learned from your introductions, many of us in this course feel really strongly about dogs in general, about our dogs, about the complexity of their personalities, about the incredible role they play in our own lives, and also about just like all the things we can't figure out about them, right? They do all these quirky things, and they're often really endearing, but they have they have a life with us. They also have a life of their own, right? They're complicated animals. So that is something that humans across time and across space have recognized about dogs. That's kind of a quasi-universal. So, again, what Morey and Jaeger say is that this practice of elevating dogs to the point of having them be a part of burials is what they call a remarkably cosmopolitan practice, right? Meaning it's something we see a lot of places, and it speaks to the importance of dogs in the human story. The final point that I want to sort of end on for this lecture is one, you didn't read this Pat Shipman, but it's a very interesting idea, and I just wanted to throw it in there because I think it really kind of sums up a lot of the ideas that we talked about in this week's material. Shipman is a biological anthropologist, and so she's really interested in human evolution, right? And she came up with this concept that she calls the animal connection. And what she suggests is that the ways that humans connect with other kinds of animals is basically a key characteristic of what it means to be human, and that animal connection has been really important in human evolution. She's talking not just about dogs, but more generally about animals, right? So, for example, she points out that, when we think about human evolution, right, what is it that makes Homo sapiens a particular sort of animal after, all of this sort of long period of change leading up to the modern Homo sapiens? And it's things like tool making, right? Things we know, using language, and things like domestication, right? She's saying there's something else that's really important, and that is a sort of meaningful and intimate relationship with animals, including dogs, but not just dogs, right? So what she's arguing is we need to take seriously that having these close, abiding relationships with animals is at the center, really, of what it means to be human, and that quality has moved human evolution over time, okay? So again, we've been sort of toying with that idea across this unit in a lot of the things you read. I think Shipman really encapsulates it with this notion of the animal connection, right? So for the rest of the course, that's a shorthand for really what we're going to be looking at, the animal connection, right? How do people and animals intersect, particularly dogs in this case, and what does that mean, both for the dogs and for the people? So we'll stop there. I hope you enjoyed this week's material, and we'll talk again soon.